Good evening. Tonight, our guest is the former president of the Republic of Latvia and the former candidate to be the United Nations Secretary General, Vaira Vīķe-Freiberga. Welcome, Madam President.
Good evening, everybody.
Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight, I would like to ask you a few questions about the international relations in the modern times and the role of the United Nations in the future. The first question, for starters, I would like to ask is to talk about our region's security. Precisely, in your opinion, on what should the regional defense in Central Europe be based? Should we all keep on relying on NATO, or should we push more to establish some kind of European army, or maybe both? Maybe we should join some other treaties or bilateral solutions. What's your opinion on that matter?
Thank you very much. It's a very pertinent question. I used to think that security was our number one concern, but in this year, 2020, of the great pandemic, obviously we have discovered that health is our right to life and limb is the first priority, although it all comes the same, whether you're being attacked by a virus or by bombs or rockets falling from the sky or being shot at, it's your right to life that is at stake. And may I, if you, with your permission, I think that since you represent a club that deals with the United Nations, I should like to remind our audience, this is the 75th year of the foundation of the United Nations, so that this anniversary has been celebrated in a number of ways. And in meetings across the world, two things have been underlined. One, we really do need an organization, an international one, a supranational one like the United Nations. If we did not have it, we would have to invent it again. Fortunately, it was done 75 years ago. Nevertheless, it was created at a time after the Second World War, which was very particular, very specific, and the sort of specific circumstances of this moment of birth for the United Nations are responsible for its structure, notably the fact that it has a Security Council with 5 permanent members that have a right of veto. This has influenced the whole development of this body and continues to do so until today. So that is one of the built-in weaknesses, apart from other aspects, of which many attempts have been made to put through reforms of the United Nations. Kofi Annan, in his time, when I was president, invited me to be an ambassador for the reform of the United Nations, and I had occasion to see close by what reforms really are needed and what the obstacles are to its creation. But what I'd most like to underline is that apart from a 75-year anniversary, there's another one, and in my eyes, possibly a more important one, certainly the most important accomplishment of the United Nations in my eyes, and that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And guess on what date it was adopted? It was the 10th of December. So that we are exactly today, we are on the anniversary, the 72nd anniversary of the United Nations General Assembly, which at that time met in Paris in 1948, adopting on this day, 10th of December, the 30 extremely important articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, along with a preamble, which I would invite any young person who is interested in international affairs and in human rights to read this very concise, brief, and very powerful document. But now, to return to your question about security, I think that we are well served by belonging to NATO all the way along the eastern border of the Baltic Sea, down from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and on to the rest of Europe. Nevertheless, we do have countries, we have them as close neighbors, Sweden across the sea, Finland in the north, Austria in the very center. And we have members of the European Union, of which we are also members, who are not members of NATO. And this creates certain difficulties and problems. For instance, when I think it was only a year ago, there were very large exercises for NATO member countries in Central Europe, and there was a need for them to be crossing to actually, if you like, simulate what would happen in the case of an attack, taking the shortest route from A to B, and one country coming to the aid to another, or armaments available in one place in Europe, even within the same country, of being moved along a highway or by air or by sea to another location. What happened? Austria declared its highways were not open to troop movements or movements of heavy military equipment. Why? Because it was summertime, and this would be an inconvenience to the holidaymakers of Austria and guests from other countries. So sorry, and we can't do that. But listen, should we happen, God forbid, should the situation happen where we need an intervention, a response to a military threat of some kind, theoretically, just assume it, the ability to respond will not be as good without having training and maneuvers on how to do it if some countries are not participating and because of their neutrality, not even allowing friendly transit through their territory, you see. So that means that some sort of emergency response capability continent-wide on the European continent would be desirable, to which even neutral countries would feel that they can participate. I think that is the desideratum. And how to formulate and what exactly it should, what shape it should take. I have participated to several high-level committees, both for the OSCE and with the European Commission, with Javier Solana, a former NATO Secretary General, at its head, and other groups about European security. We do have problems within NATO, first of all, in terms of an ideal ability to respond. But most of all, on a European level, things could be better if we had, and frankly, already last fall, before the pandemic, when I was addressing the French Senate about, it was a ceremony about the fall of the wall of Berlin and talking about security and freedom in Europe, I'm already at that time, before the pandemic, I mentioned what happens supposing we have a pandemic. And there's a need, as did happen, of Spain and Italy and parts of France needing emergency equipment, protective equipment for medical staff, which was not available, which Sweden was sending down ready to, and I think, I'm not sure about Finland as well. And it had to transit through other countries, notably Germany and Austria. And again, there were difficulties. Even France, when it closed its borders, was not leaving, not allowing transports coming through France to go to Italy with medical supplies, you see. This sort of thing should not happen. Even if a country closes its borders to movement of persons, the movement of medical goods, or as in other situations, the defensive necessities should be allowed. And so far, we have not developed a continent-wide mechanism to do so.
Thank you very much for that answer. So, both in a shortcut. We need to cooperate with NATO and with European Union and also non-European Union countries to ensure the defense of our continent. I would like to jump to another topic right now, because there was a lot of discussion following the introduction of the parity laws in Germany about underrepresentation of women in leadership positions. both in the administration, in the public administration, and in business. How do you, as a senior figure, senior woman who used to be a president of country, think that we should tackle this problem? Do you believe that we should tackle it in the German way, or there is another path we should follow to ensure that the women are equally represented in all branches of government?
Well, I'm afraid I will have to answer much as before by saying that we need both. And it all depends on the circumstances. As a scientist for most of my career, any promotions or rewards or awards that I received, I would have always wanted to be quite sure that they were based on my accomplishments and my merits, and not because there was a quota that such and such a prize should be given out, every year, half women and half men or something like that, but that truly that you are recognized for what you have done. Because to me, the ultimate of non-discrimination is that a person is evaluated as a person. And therefore, getting a position because I'm a woman goes against that principle. And I am for the principle that all persons should be considered equal. I have always wished, as a refugee child, as an immigrant in several different lands, to be treated as an equal, as a person, not labeled by something. When you are labeling somebody as a woman, you're carrying a label on yourself and you're no longer a person without any qualifications. This said, when prejudice is truly very deep and very systematic, then quotas or other measures, by the way. And may I tell you a very interesting solution to gender discrimination, of which the Wiener Philharmoniker, you may, some of you may watch, we in our family, we watch on every 1st of January, the Wiener Philharmoniker, this beautiful concert hall and a wonderful program of all the Strausses and the best conductors of the world conducting and so on. Well, the Wiener Philharmoniker, the Philharmonic Orchestra was, well, in competition with the Berliner Philharmoniker, saying they're the best in the world. And it just so happened that they didn't have a single woman. And the decades would roll by and still no woman. Well, they claimed that they have auditions. If there's a new position available in whatever instrument, their candidates are invited, they play, a committee with a good musical ear and experience listens to them, and lo and behold, the years go by and never any woman was judged good enough to be part of the Wiener Philharmoniker, and the musicians would say, well, you see, this just shows you women are not quite up to it, to the level as men. We can't help it. We go by quality, you know. So one woman actually went to court, and she said she would like to have an audition behind a screen, so that committee would listen to the music played without seeing whether the player, the musician playing, was a man or a woman. And guess what? Guess what? Behind a screen, they picked the best player, and it happened to be a woman for the first time. And ever since, they auditioned behind a screen. Now, if you look at the Wiener Philharmoniker next January 1st, that's not far away, watch how many women there are. Not that many, but they're there. That's not a quota. That's an extremely fair way of evaluating. To me, that is ideal. But I have been invited by many business women's groups in both in the Netherlands and in Germany, especially Germany, when they were trying to get through this legislation to require companies, large companies, that receive funds and orders from the government. So in other words, were partially subsidized by the taxpayer. They should have parity, men and women, on their governing boards. This is not playing the violin, you know, the first or second violin or the tuba or whatever. This is something that any intelligent person with a university education, frankly, typically should be able to do that sort of thing. Or a person who has experience in banking or in the dry goods and etc. etc. There, this requirement made a difference. Because there again, the gentlemen would invite their friends and their acquaintances and the member of their club and smoke cigars together and say, well, when men get together, they like to tell slightly off-color jokes, and if a woman is around, that it sort of cramps their style and they can't be quite so free. Well, it's too bad. It's just too bad. If it's a job to be done, like governing a company, then by all means, I think quotas are actually justifiable.
Thank you very much. I'd like to also ask you about that moment when you were a candidate for the United Nations Secretary General. What do you think about the recurring ideas to reform the UN, in particular the UN Security Council, about which you told us about in the very beginning? How would you see the future of the United Nations? How would you see that situation changed?
I think it's clear, not just to myself, but to everybody who looks at the situation, that the structure of the Security Council is an anachronism. It has been the rotating members, the elected members. By the way, Latvia is postulating in a few years to be part of these rotating members. That sort of thing, that works fine. Everybody gets a turn, even if it takes, a number of years. But the 5 countries that have the veto right are, you might say, the United Nations has been progressing and doing great things in the world, but it's doing with a wooden leg. And that wooden leg is that the permanent members of the Security Council. That's one of the parts that is really, truly slowing it down in many cases. But interestingly enough, the General Assembly, which is after all the ultimate power, the General Assembly has found a lot of creative ways of moving around the vetoes, the predictable vetoes of some countries on certain questions at this core of the Security Council, and so that it is possible to make progress and to move ahead up to a point. But it's not just the only aspect. There are many other aspects of the functioning. It's a huge organization, don't you see? And it's dependent on voluntary donations. That is one of the problems. The United States sort of grows hot and cold in its feelings towards the United Nations. Now it pays its dues and now it does not, and so on. This makes for a budget that is not a stable budget. Another thing that I discovered when I was on named by Kofi Annan to look into it is that they have projects, programs that have started. Money is invested with a certain goal. They do not have a termination of programs system built into it. And when we were 5 of us tasked with this reform question, when we tried to get the General Assembly to accept various projects from way back, from 10 years back, being simply looked through and checked whether they achieved their goal, how much money had been spent, what had been the result, was the project still ongoing, had it been terminated? There was a hue and cry and an outcry. Countries who were benefiting from projects that were going on and on and on and on without being evaluated or stopped after they had accomplished their aim, of course, did not like the idea of a critical look at their necessity. And so several thousand projects were terminated, but with protests frequently. And then the whole business slowed down and was just, things were left as they stand. And that's frequently the case. The member countries, you see, the member states, they determine the tone of what happens. So if this is why diplomacy is so important at the United Nations. Do not ever believe that your country's representative at the United Nations has a soft job and they only go to cocktail parties and meet people in exotic costumes and so on. No, no, no. The diplomatic work at the United Nations, getting sufficient votes for any kind of important decision that you or your country believes in to take place, it can take years of preparation. But imagine, we do have the Declaration of Human Rights, and if only every country, every member country followed it, we'd have a wonderful world to live in.
Well, that's the dream, I think.
It's good to have a sort of standard towards which we should be trying to reach.
Yes, that is, well, that is some kind of a benchmark we should be trying to reach. We should be trying to strive to accomplish. But you mentioned the United States and attitude towards United Nations, and this I would like to ask you about. Yes, you mentioned the United States and the attitude towards United Nations, and I'd like to ask you about the thing that the current soon-to-be ex-president Trump has told us a lot of times during these years of his tenure. The discussion about the nature of international relations. Should we focus more on the bilateral actions, or should we follow the path we are following right now? So the more multilateral approach that strengthens the international organizations and the multilateral treaties, coalitions. What should be the base of our international relations?
If you take literally the principles on which the United Nations was founded 75 years ago, then it's clear that what we're looking to have is a rule-governed world where international relations are regulated by certain universally accepted rules, such as, well, notably this concept of human rights, but also about the respect of certain treaties. So that the whole world can be on the same page when it comes to responding to crises, challenges, difficulties, unforeseen events. The World Health Organization was created to take care, well, take care is quite not the word, but if you say to respond to health crises, and we have had such ongoing crises as malaria in the world, which still has not been vanquished. On the other hand, we have had successes where diseases, childhood diseases like the measles, which can have serious consequences, including death. Measles has been practically eliminated because of vaccination. So that such international organizations set up the rules and would then give out recommendations to their member states as to how to proceed in fighting this disease or the other. And similarly, the Paris Climate Accords were something that were arrived at where the whole planet, ideally, the whole planet would agree on the general outlines of the steps to take so that we do not destroy the environment that we live on and that on which the survival of the human race actually depends on. Our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren will be inheriting a horribly messed up world if this generation and the next two do not take really serious steps to diminish the effects that create climate change, that create the extinction of species, that create the pollution of our oceans with unbelievable masses of plastic, practically continents of plastic floating in a Pacific Ocean and things of that nature. So for questions of that nature, you do need international agreement, at least a minimal agreement on principle. Bilateral relations are necessary. And here again, this is why countries have as many ambassadors as they can afford to have in as many countries that they feel that they have a need to have relations with. If you have serious trade, either as a buyer or as a seller, say, with another country, then of course it would be very foolish not to have your ambassador there and that country's ambassador in your country, so that they can talk to each other and after these discussions communicate with their capitals and get directives and so on, and then give new information and that sort of thing. Bilateral relations are the bread and butter of diplomacy and of a peaceful world. When nations talk to each other, the chance of armed conflict arising between them is certainly diminished, except when, as in the case, say, of Hitler and Stalin, they talked to each other and were lying through their teeth all the time, and naturally then there's nothing you can do about it.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Thank you for the meeting tonight, for accepting our invitation. It was really a very, very interesting evening. I hope we could see each other again at some events of our organization, maybe sometime in person after the epidemic ends. And once again, thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope you talk to each other. That is the most important thing. Talk to each other and listen to each other. I wish you health and happiness and success.
Thank you very much.